What's up, dogs? Today we're going to look at Anarcho-Primitivism. Primitivists argue in favour of dismantling civilization, ending our reliance on sophisticated technology, and shifting to a simple hunter-gatherer lifestyle similar to that which prevailed before the development of agriculture. Obviously, this is a fringe position, even among anarchists. I think there are a lot of people who view it as being little more than a meme. Okay, civilization has its problems, but why on earth would anybody want to abandon wonderful things like medical care, electricity, space exploration, weather tracking systems, easy access to luxurious food and water, and so on, we're going to take this position seriously and try to get into what the actual arguments for it are. So essentially there are, as I see it, three basic prongs to the primitivist argument. First of all, primitivists are inspired by a reappraisal of the nature of life in hunter-gatherer society. Second, there are the environmental consequences of civilization. And third, there are the consequences of civilization on humans. Particularly, primitivists focus on how civilization and modern technology necessarily cause a loss of liberty and autonomy. So I'm going to discuss the first two fairly briefly because I think the third is the most philosophically interesting. But let's go through these. So first of all, then, we have the reappraisal of hunter-gatherer life. Now, the traditional view of hunter-gatherers, which prevailed in academia up until around the 1960s, was that life in a state of nature, life outside of civilization, was, as Hobbes once put it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Small-scale societies are racked by violence, disease, starvation, the constant threat of predation and natural disaster. Humans lived with no control over their lives or their environment. Every day was spent toiling just to survive, barely any leisure time, and no time to spend on building a culture. Over the millennia, humans gradually developed the tools to start building civilization. The major revolution was the Neolithic Revolution, the introduction of agriculture. And with agriculture, we were able to shift from living in bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers to forming permanent settlements where we could generate a surplus of food beyond immediate subsistence needs. And this, that's freed us up. This gave people, the ability to sustain larger, more complex social organisation. It gave people the time to spend doing other things than just what is required to survive, than just subsistence activities. So this was the first step towards the more peaceful, prosperous way of life that we currently have now. Now, that's the traditional picture. All of this changed quite considerably in the 1960s due to anthropologists such as Marshall Sahlins and Richard B. Lee in particular. So it turns out, if you look at contemporary hunter-gatherers, and if you look at the evidence concerning mortality rates and health and so on among prehistoric peoples, hunter-gatherer life is not nearly as bad as I just suggested. Hunter-gatherers have fairly varied diets, they have a reasonable amount of leisure time, their social structure is highly egalitarian, and very often the basic needs of all of the members of the band are fairly easily met. Indeed, Sahlins described hunter-gatherers as the original affluent society. So, in the modern world, affluence is a matter of having access to a wide variety of resources. We have many desires, plus high consumption rates. We have a lot of stuff to satisfy our many desires. By contrast, the hunter-gatherer way of life involves simple needs which are easily met. They have no particular desire for accumulating material wealth, so the modest means available to them are more than adequate. This is what Sahlins calls the Zen road to affluence. So I just want to go through some recent figures. I've gotten these from Mark Cohen's article, History, Diet and Hunter-Gatherers. Cohen says that hunter-gatherers are actually fairly well nourished, certainly in comparison to the poor of civilization. So the San Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert consume approximately 2,000 calories per day, and they have a fairly varied diet, so that malnutrition is rare. The Hadza tribe of Tanzania consume approximately 3,000 calories per day. Again, malnutrition is rare. Compare these figures with the modern urban poor in undeveloped nations who may consume only around 1,500 calories per day, and malnutrition is very common, even for those who do have regular access to food. Furthermore, hunter-gatherers receive 20 to 40% of their diet from animal products, which is well above the modern world average. So the overall picture is that hunter-gatherer societies are actually often better nourished than many people, even in the modern world, to say nothing, of course, of civilizations throughout history, which in many ways were much, much worse. So the development of agriculture supported larger populations, but it didn't really seem to improve the health and diet of those populations. There was a greater quantity of food, so you could feed more people, but it was of a much poorer quality. With agriculture, humans became dependent on fewer food sources, the primary diet was reduced to just a few crops, and this resulted in a lot of malnutrition. And of course, sometimes starvation if the crops didn't grow. Now consider disease. Disease, of course, has always been one of the primary killers of humans, and even in the modern world, parasites are a serious problem in poorer countries, and they also have a significant impact on nutrition because they cause diarrhea and other ailments like that. Unsurprisingly, parasite load increases with the size and density of a population and the permanence of the settlement. So disease is comparatively less of a problem for hunter-gatherers. When a population settles in one place and produces a food surplus, you find that you get a dense population, lots of people mingling together, filth accumulates, stored food rots, water supplies are easily contaminated. There's just general problems with sanitation, which encourages the spread of disease. And another big aspect of this is that hunter-gatherers spend far less time around animals because they don't domesticate them. Take, for instance, the tapeworm life cycle. Tapeworm is passed to domestic animals from human feces and then from the animals back to other humans. Obviously, that kind of thing is rather less of a problem for hunter-gatherers. So hunter-gatherers are less threatened by disease, and this in turn means that not only do hunter-gatherers have a higher caloric intake and a more varied diet, their nutritional needs are actually lower, because disease will increase the required. So parasites like tapeworms and so on will mean that you'll need more nutrition. So hunter-gatherers are relatively healthy, certainly compared to many historical civilizations, and even compared to some populations in the modern world. Cohen points out that these points are confirmed by skeletal analysis. The transition to agriculture in the Neolithic Revolution saw increased skeletal lesions associated with yaws, leprosy, tuberculosis, syphilis, anemia, and rickets. So all of these either increased or only appeared with the advent of civilization. Finally, Cohen reports that the advent of civilization is almost always associated with a decline in height, which is another strong indicator of disease and malnutrition. There are other aspects in which hunter-gatherer life is fairly reasonable. Among the San Bushmen, work time, which we can define as time spent on activities required for survival, such as food acquisition and processing, is between 40 to 45 hours per week. That's less than the work time of most people in industrial societies, at least when time spent on household chores and commuting and so on is included. So hunter-gatherers have a reasonable amount of leisure time. Finally, in terms of their overall social relations, hunter-gatherer groups have less social stratification than civilized people. Of course, part of the reason for this is that they don't produce any kind of surplus. They don't produce a food surplus. Hunter-gatherers simply live day to day, taking what they need when they need it. They never build up a significant surplus of resources that can then be taken to support to sustain a class of elite non-producing people. So, I have painted with a very broad brush here. These are massive generalizations. Obviously, there's a lot of variety among real hunter-gatherer groups. Like at the end of the day, if you want to, get into the details of comparing hunter-gatherer life to, the modern life and so on, you'd have to watch some videos on anthropology and archaeology and so on, which I'm not making. But, as I say, these are very broad brushstrokes. And of course, it isn't all sunshine and roses. Childhood mortality rates in hunter-gatherer groups are high. I mean, certainly compared to modern civilization. For people who make it to 15, they could expect to live maybe another 40 years. So, there's high death rates for children, and if you manage to make it beyond childhood, you've got a life expectancy of like 50 to 60, which, isn't as good as what we've got. Although, of course, these things were no better in the civilized world until very recently. In Europe in the 1600s, half of all people died before the age of 8. So, again, compared to many civilized people, hunter-gatherers aren't so bad here. But anyway, the point of all of this is there has been something of a reappraisal of hunter-gatherer life by anthropologists and archaeologists. At least this happened way back in the 60s, and as far as I can tell, that some of the stronger claims involved in this reappraisal may have been may have been dropped by now, but the general message that that traditional view that life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, that's probably false. It turns out primitive life wasn't as bad as we thought, and this has been unsurprisingly a key influence on anarcho-primitivism. Although perhaps primitivists sometimes overstate just how good it was. But anyway, as John Zerzan in Future Primitive puts it, and I quote, "Life before domestication/agriculture was in fact largely one of leisure, intimacy with nature, sensual wisdom, sexual equality, and health." And by contrast, of course, the development of civilization wasn't all it's cracked up to be. And, a particularly important point here with respect to anarchism is that as soon as civilization arises, the problems pointed out by anarchists become particularly acute and particularly strongly entrenched. Every long-lasting, large-scale civilization has failed to be anarchistic, right? We find authoritarian states, we find class divisions, we find feudal systems and wage labour and all of this stuff. I mean, pockets of anarchy sometimes emerge within civilizations, but they rarely achieve any long-term change. Once you get civilization, it looks like you get authoritarianism and hierarchy in a particularly acute way. Okay, so that is one plank of the primitivist argument. Life outside of civilization wasn't so bad. But this in itself doesn't tell us much because, even if life in hunter-gatherer times was okay, maybe civilization is a lot better. So now we come to the critique of civilization. And so this is the second plank in the primitivist argument, which is that civilization has devastating impacts on the environment. Indeed, civilization is self-destructive insofar as it requires a stable environment, right? You don't have a civilization unless you have a stable environment in which that civilization can flourish, but it also destroys the environment, so it undermines the conditions required for its own existence. Now, I take it that we're all perfectly familiar with the environmental crisis, so I'm not going to go into detail on this. But, modern civilization may have improved our standards of living, but there is a cost. And the cost is such that the increased standards of living are perhaps unlikely to be maintained. Some of the contemporary problems include climate change, ocean acidification, deforestation, topsoil depletion, pollution in the air and water, massive biodiversity loss, introduction of invasive species, and so on. We're currently in a major extinction event, the Holocene extinction. Extinction rates right now are, I think on a conservative estimate, 100 to 1,000 times greater than background extinction rates. And that's probably only going to get worse. Our current way of life is unsustainable, so there seems to be little doubt that civilization as we know it can't continue for much longer. I mean, regardless of what benefits it brings us. Many civilizations in the past collapsed due to their devastating environmental impact, and the primitivists will say there's a great danger of us going the same way. By contrast, hunter-gatherer life is less environmentally damaging. We lived as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years without seriously destabilizing the biosphere. So we know that it is sustainable in the long term, which isn't to say that it has no environmental costs, of course. I mean, it does. Hunter-gatherers are certainly not perfect, but the point is, the primitivist will think civilization is significantly worse. Okay, let's turn to the third part of the argument for primitivism. And this is the impact of civilization on humans. And as I say, I think this is the most philosophically interesting aspect of anarcho-primitivism. Now, basically all anarchists will be able to identify problems with modern technology. There are various ways in which technologies are used to restrict our liberties and to enforce hierarchical power structures. But most forms of anarchism want to fix these problems by changing how technology is used, distributed, and controlled. Technology in itself is seen as neutral. So the standard view on this is it is because of its role in a capitalist statist system that technology sometimes leads to bad outcomes. Right? But the technology just in itself, right, that can be put to all sorts of different purposes. After all, what is technology? Well, broadly speaking, technology is the application of objects and skillful craft to problem solving. And surely we can put that to any end that we want, including the end of advancing human autonomy, advancing liberty, advancing egalitarianism. So the key to solving the problems associated with technology is to transform how we use technology. A primitivist is going to object that there are problems with civilization and technology in themselves. Reforming civilization will inevitably fail to address the fundamental problems with it, in much the same way that most anarchists would say that reforming capitalism or reforming the state would fail to address the fundamental problems with them. You can't actually reform civilization because it's just in the nature of civilization that it leads to these bad outcomes. So why is this? Well, one of the key ideas in a lot of primitivist literature is that civilization is fundamentally based on the domestication of natural items. Civilization reduces the natural world into a collection of entities that have no independent value, or they're seen as having no independent value. All plants and animals and other natural items just become a set of instrumental resources for human use. They are resources that we can alter and control according to human interests. When a population develops agriculture, for instance, they no longer simply live on the land, they strictly control and regiment the land. The land becomes an object of human domination. So we shift from taking what we find in the land in a kind of reciprocal manner, we shift from living as part of the biosphere to transforming and dominating it, to strictly controlling it in accordance with a set of rules. Or consider how civilization alters animals, right? Compare the domesticated animal to the wild animal. And the claim is this domination of nature, this domestication of nature, is a necessary feature of civilization. There would just be no way to extract sufficient resources to sustain civilization without the transformation and domination of nature. Now, the key claim that primitivists make here is that civilization has the same effect on humans, right? In civilization, humans are domesticated, humans are transformed into instrumental resources, humans are dominated by the society as a whole. Humans become, like everything else, resources. They become cogs in the machine to sustain civilization rather than autonomous beings. And that's the case even for those of us who are relatively affluent. So now we can begin to see why primitivists reject the idea of reforming civilization. Civilization is a means of dominating the natural world. We take some land or species or item or whatever and turn it into a tool for our purposes. And what primitivists will say is you can't use a means of domination to achieve the end of liberation and egalitarianism. If you are an anarchist, if you are committed to abolishing hierarchy, you can't use a means of domination to achieve that. On this point, primitivists will draw on something known as the prefigurative principle. This is a principle that has been observed by the vast majority of anarchists. Indeed, it's sometimes seen as part of the theoretical justification for anarchism, as part of what really distinguishes anarchism from other related political movements. So the prefigurative principle requires a kind of coherence between means and ends. The idea is that your means that you use in a political struggle must match, in some sense, the ends that you are trying to achieve. So to see where this, to see why we might accept this, take the traditional Marxists, right? Like, Marxists aim for a stateless, classless society which promotes equality and liberty, but they will use the apparatus of the state to attempt to achieve this. They will use hierarchical, authoritarian methods in pursuit of egalitarian, anti-authoritarian ends. And for the anarchist, this is absurd. This can't work. So suppose that a socialist party achieves state power, and suppose that most of the members of this party genuinely desire to liberate the working people. Well, one problem here, as the old saying goes, is that power corrupts. These politicians will now have a position of authority over the working class, and they will act by imposing their will upon the working class. In this environment, they will learn that the exercise of power over other people is how you get things done, and sooner or later, the majority of them will lose even the desire to give up their power. To quote Bakunin, he says, "Worker deputies transplanted into a bourgeois environment, into an atmosphere of purely bourgeois ideas, will in fact cease to be workers, and, becoming statesmen, they will become bourgeois. For men do not make their situations, on the contrary, men are made by them." So you put people in this position of authority, right? Even if they're very well intentioned, right? The authority will corrupt them, basically. And a second point here is that the working people, even if they're fully committed to the socialist cause, if they place their trust in this political party, in this tool of authority, they will become people who simply follow orders from that authority. They will not learn how to take control and direct their own lives, which is what they have to do if you actually want to build an egalitarian society. So, this prefigurative principle is not a normative principle, right? The prefigurative principle doesn't say that, it's morally good for means to cohere with ends. Rather, it's a practical point. According to anarchists, it's impossible, or at least extraordinarily unlikely, that you could build a free, egalitarian society using authoritarian, coercive methods. The prefigurative principle tells us that if we are to have any realistic hope of realizing some value, the tactics used in pursuit of that value must themselves embody that value. So the organization of a political struggle must prefigure the kind of society that we're trying to achieve. And applying this to civilization, well, the primitivist will say, look, attempting to reform civilization involves using a tool of domination, a tool that domesticates and controls. Right? You're trying to use that tool as a means of liberating people. But by the principles that are already accepted by anarchists, this cannot work. So this is the kind of abstract argument, right? That civilization, just fundamentally, in the way that it functions, right, the way that it operates on the most basic level, it is a tool of control and domination, right? And in accordance with the prefigurative principle, which is accepted by pretty much all anarchists, you're not going to be able to use that tool as a means of genuinely liberating people. So, this is perhaps all rather abstract, but primitivists have given some more detailed accounts of precisely how it is that technology and civilization lead to a loss of liberty. One point that's worth bearing in mind here is that primitivists tend to draw a distinction between tools and technology. See, for instance, John Moore's A Primitivist Primer. A tool is an object that can be made by a single individual or is produced by the cooperation of many individuals on a single occasion. So think of canoes, spears, digging sticks, walls, pots. These are things that I can make right now on my own, or I can just get together with a bunch of people and just do it in a relatively short space of time, right? It's like just us working together. We can build this thing in one or maybe a few different occasions. That's a tool. Technology, by contrast, consists of objects produced by, and I quote, large-scale interlocking systems of extraction, production, distribution, and consumption. Now, these systems have several important features that lead to a loss of autonomy and liberty. First, it's simply in the nature of these systems that they will gain their own momentum, so that individual humans, even large groups of humans working together, just don't have any control over them. Indeed, individuals won't even have any understanding of them. So think of all the items in your house, right? Even a relatively simple thing like a toilet and the plumbing system. Can you explain how that works? Could you build one yourself? Probably not. And this is nothing like the tools of primitive societies, where basically everybody at least understands what they're doing and could probably build them themselves or guide others to build them. Technology has a host of unpredictable consequences and develops in unpredictable ways. Here's an interesting example from Ted Kaczynski. Yes, that Ted Kaczynski. I cite Kaczynski here not to be edgy, but because his work is actually quite rigorous and has had an enormous impact on the anarcho-primitivist movement. So anyway, he says, look, each specific technological advance, right, seems to satisfy some need. It seems to grant us with new abilities, thereby increasing freedom. So he says, consider the introduction of motorized transport. Initially, motorized vehicles just gave people the choice to travel faster and further. Nobody was required to purchase a car, so those who preferred walking could continue their lives as before, and those who wanted to try the car could use it as a tool to achieve their goals more easily. But soon, motorized transport starts to transform societies in unexpected ways. So as cars became more common, regulations had to be introduced. People using cars could no longer act autonomously, but they had to stringently obey the flow of traffic and the traffic laws. Obligations were laid down upon car owners: driver licenses, insurance, vehicle maintenance, road tax, and so on. And as the roads filled with cars, even the people who preferred walking were subject to increasingly strict restrictions, right? Like as the roads fill with cars, well, you can no longer just walk where you please, when you please. Your activity is now also going to be guided and constrained by the traffic flow. Furthermore, motorized vehicles increased economic efficiency and provided the foundations for further technological development, which this further development then rendered the use of such vehicles in practice mandatory. For the majority of people, motorized transport is required in order to live a normal life, because many of the things that you need are just no longer within walking distance, right? Society develops so that on the expectation that everybody can just get into a car, right? So or maybe not a car, maybe a bus, whatever, but some sort of motorized transport. So your job may no longer be within walking distance. The shops may no longer be within walking distance. So what we have is that an initially desirable and apparently innocuous technological development takes on a life of its own and ends up massively restricting human autonomy. And this point obviously generalizes to other forms of technology. So the primitivists have this picture of civilization as a machine that develops beyond the control of any particular individuals, even the individuals who rule it. The course of civilization, the way it changes the world, and the way it changes us cannot be directed. We just get swept along with it. A second source of the loss of autonomy and liberty is that technology leads to large-scale impersonal institutions in which the behaviour of the people involved has to be rigidly controlled. So in order to sustain a technological society, we need to put people to work continually constructing it and consuming its products. And for this reason, technology requires mass obedience. It doesn't matter what the technology is, or what the purpose the technology is used for, rather it's because of the way that technology is produced with these large-scale interlocking systems. Life in modern society is structured by rigid rules outside of the individual's control. We've already seen, for instance, that when travelling, you have no choice but to obey the flow of traffic and the traffic signals and so on. When working, you have to obey the rules laid down by the employer, by the state, by the organisation. Even if you're the boss of a particular workplace, or even if you own the company, your capacity to make autonomous decisions is strictly limited. You will be subject to regulation from the state, and you will have to develop your business within the constraints laid down by the rest of technological society. Again, consider how businesses were forced to alter in response to the development of motorised transport. So all people, even those at the top, they get swept along by the development of civilization, and from birth people are raised so as to conform to these constraints. Human behaviour and indeed human desires are modified to conform with the requirements of technological civilization. Furthermore, in any large, highly organised system like this, any decisions and changes will affect many thousands or millions of people at once. Often, decisions are simply out of the hands of most people. They're made by politicians or the executives of corporations. Now, traditional anarchists are highly critical of this kind of hierarchical structure, so they will promote greater democracy. This is supposed to... The idea is to give the decision-making to the people. But there are two problems with this. First of all, in this democratized society, people are being asked to make decisions about things that they have no understanding of, and the changes will affect their lives in ways that nobody can anticipate. I mean, we've already made this point, right? No individual can understand how all of the technology around them operates, how all the different parts of society function to produce that technology, or the ways in which some new piece of technology will affect society in the future, right? So the decisions that people are being asked to make, right? These are decisions that they're sort of alienated from, in the sense that they can have no understanding of what it is they're actually being asked to make a decision about. Second, even under democracy, there will be so many individuals all involved, all coordinating, that the decision of a single individual will be irrelevant. What's the point of voting? It makes no difference. Indeed, a single individual won't have the power to influence enough individuals, to even influence enough individuals to make a difference. Compare this to hunter-gatherers, right? Hunter-gatherers live in groups of a few dozen people, and for groups of that size, you actually can have an influence. I mean, your voice makes a difference, and you have a good chance of, well, maybe not a good chance, but you have some chance of persuading the rest of them to, see your point of view. So, for all of these reasons, in civilization, greater democracy may well be an improvement, but it cannot put people in the position of being able to perform autonomous, informed actions. It cannot give people the power to make these autonomous and informed decisions, because the problem lies with the large scale nature of technological society itself. I mean, so consider how this kind of thing plays out in dealing with threats, say, threats to physical security. In primitive life, people know how to deal with the things that they perceive as threats. Of course, some threats are out of their hands. There are sudden natural disasters, but by and large, the environment is stable over a person's lifetime. There's a sense of control over threats. A hunter-gatherer knows how to find food, how to find water, how to build shelters, how to fight off animals, and so on. And they can do that either on their own or in small bands that they can actually influence. So when deciding what the best thing to do would, to ensure physical safety would be, you can actually have an influence on the decision that is ultimately made, and you can understand that decision. By contrast, in modern civilization, we fear threats that are completely out of our hands. We have to just trust the safety standards of nuclear power plants. We have to just trust that the universities that provided the accreditation for our doctors are competent. We have to trust that the state is competent to deal with terrorism and to maintain clean air and so on. Our livelihoods are dependent on the decisions of our employers. etc. By and large, these threats are imposed and they are dealt with by other people and other institutions, large and remote from our influence. Democratizing this process, removing the hierarchies and so on, would make actually very little difference. Whether these decisions are made democratically or dictatorially or in any other way, they are fundamentally out of our hands. So, our physical security, right, which in primitive life a person has this kind of autonomous control over their physical security, which you do not have in modern life. That is the claim, at any rate. Changes that occur in modern society are therefore imposed upon individuals, and we have no sense that we have built our environment and that we can direct our own lives. John Moore quotes Fifth Estate: "The enormous size, complex interconnections and stratification of tasks which make up modern technological systems make authoritarian command necessary and independent individual decision-making impossible." An anarchist revolution would make no difference to this. In order to sustain technological civilization, we need people to carefully observe a vast set of rules and regulations. There is no alternative to this while still maintaining technology. So it's just in the nature of these systems that people's behaviour must be tightly regulated. So authoritarianism and hierarchy are products of civilization, not specifically capitalism or the state or any other particular civilized system. In the same way that you cannot use the authoritarian, coercive, dominating structure of the state to establish a free and equal society, neither can you use the dominating structure of civilization to do this. In the same way that state power tends to overwhelm the good intentions of socialists who try to utilize it, the same is true for technological power and technological institutions. It is simply in the nature of these organizations that they coerce individuals and that they develop in ways independent of the intentions of the members. So with civilization, there is a severe loss of liberty and autonomy, and that's just a necessary feature of civilization. An important point to note about this argument is that any primitivist who endorses it need not be committed to a particularly rosy view of actual hunter-gatherer societies. In principle, the primitivist could hold that many hunter-gatherer societies have similar problems. The point is that these problems of hierarchy, authority and so on, these are inevitable products of civilization. They are inevitable products of mass organization. They are not inevitable products of hunter-gatherer existence. That's the critique of civilization. Now, the rejection of civilization does, of course, raise a question. Just how far back should we go? And perhaps the most radical proposals here are made by John Zerzan, who in his book Running on Emptiness argues that the problems of domestication and loss of autonomy begin with essentially symbolic thought, what he calls mediations, but essentially symbolic thought. Zerzan critiques language, numbers, art, and our concept of structured time. So I just want to briefly outline Zerzan's argument as I understand it. So Zerzan argues that with symbolic thought we have the beginnings of domestication, and this is because symbolic thought is a tool that controls and molds reality to our ends. So our concepts are constructed by our minds, and then these are used to structure our experience and make it open to manipulation. We live in a world of concepts. Everything around us is understood conceptually, right? And therefore we live in a manipulable world. Symbolic thought concepts, symbolic thought replaces real, immediate experience with an abstract, constructed representation, which is then open to control. It uses one thing for another. So you have this kind of general schema of let A stand for X, as opposed to letting A be A and letting X be X. And this leads to a loss of value because we lose contact with authentic reality, with the world as it is in itself. And not only do we lose contact with the external world, we lose contact even with ourselves. We come to conceive of ourselves via symbolization, via concepts. So rather than having a direct experience of the world and ourselves, all of our experience is filtered through these symbols. Now, just like technology, symbolization may initially seem to create greater freedom for people. It may initially seem to enable us to interact with the world in entirely new ways and open up new abilities. But just as symbolization domesticates the world, it domesticates us as well. We access the world and we access ourselves via symbolic thought. Symbols therefore guide our very way of thinking and control and direct our behaviour. Shared symbol systems, right? The shared concepts and the shared language of our society, these are therefore tools for maintaining social order. And like civilization more generally, a society's symbol system, its language, its concepts, its art, this comes to take on a life of its own. No person can direct it while it shapes all of us. So the very way that I experience the world and experience myself is a product of this system constructed by others. Now, Zerzan's criticism of symbolic thought obviously raises the question, well, what exactly would non-symbolic thought be? Well, of course, we can't really conceive of this, but perhaps we can gesture in the direction. Zerzan quotes James Shreve, and I quote, "Where the modern's gods might inhabit the land, the buffalo or the blade of grass, the Neanderthal's spirit was the animal or the grass blade, the thing and its soul perceived as a single vital force, with no need to distinguish them with separate names." So it seems that the idea is that whereas symbolism breaks down the world into parts and treats each part atomistically and as having some specific instrumental use, non-symbolic thought embraces the wholeness of nature. Zerzan often talks of the wholeness or fullness of the direct experience of things, experience when it is unmediated by symbols and concepts. And this would involve a much greater sensory awareness, a full appreciation of all sensory input. Symbolic thought domesticates the senses. Consider how we tend to treat vision as the primary sense. We often think in terms of vision, even when we talk about unrelated topics. We will often use visual metaphors. Knowledge is often framed in terms of visual metaphors, as when we say things like, "I see what you mean," or "your argument is unclear," or "this is an illuminating presentation," right? We describe knowledge and learning and things like that via these metaphors of vision. So in the Western world, at least, vision is central. So first of all, symbolic thought carves up the senses, right? We separate vision from the rest of the senses. And then second, one of the senses is placed atop a hierarchy and the other senses are suppressed, right? So we've kind of carved up our senses into vision, smell, touch, taste, and so on, right? And then we've sort of given vision the central place. And this transforms how we relate to the world. Vision, taken in itself, transforms the person into a spectator, into somebody standing outside of the world looking into it. Right? Vision presents us with objects bearing certain properties separate from us. So the shape and colour of an object appear to be intrinsic properties of the object. They exist in the object separately from the viewer. And with this strict distinction between the viewer and the separate world that is viewed, right, we can easily end up getting domination of one over the other. I mean, compare this with the interactive nature of the tactile sense, or with smell, right? When you smell something, the properties of that thing is felt like inside you, or at least it's no longer kind of an intrinsic property of something separate from you. So without symbolic thought, the idea is, well, what we experience in vision would be experienced as just one aspect of a single sense, this like whole, rich, interactive sensory unity. Symbolic thought also sustains linguistic communication, and this permits a greater physical separation of people, so it tends to push us away from face-to-face interactions. Zerzan claims that communication prior to the development of language involved all the senses in a way that our communication today does not, although I must say it's unclear to me what the evidence for that claim is supposed to be. But anyway, just as symbolic thought creates a separation between man and nature, it also creates a separation between man and man. Or woman, I suppose. So, that is anarcho-primitivism. Now, before we end, I would like to go through some objections. First of all, there is the empirical objection. Primitivists are often accused of romanticism with respect to hunter-gatherers. Primitivists, it is said, have a picture of our primitive life that is far too rosy. Now, I certainly think this is true for some primitivists. So, John Zerzan, for instance, is extremely frustrating to read. He will leap from one society to another, from one piece of ethnographic writing to another, extracting whatever parts support the peaceful, egalitarian, healthy ideal, and then just ignoring everything else. It is true, I think, that the traditional view of hunter-gatherers is false, right? Their lives were not as bad as traditionally assumed, but there are at least some primitivists who have this tendency to cherry-pick only the rosiest depictions and then ignore or downplay the research on the more unpleasant aspects. Actually, one of the best critiques that I've read on this particular point comes from Ted Kaczynski in his article, The Truth About Primitive Life. I mean, Kaczynski is kind of a primitivist himself, as already mentioned. Certainly he's against industrial civilization. But he's very critical of the way that contemporary anarcho-primitivists have argued their case. He provides a very thorough analysis of the empirical problems with many primitivist arguments. So he sort of goes through the ethnographic literature and has some interesting observations from his own time living outside of civilization. You will often find primitivists descending into just outright mysticism and pseudoscience. So in Future Primitive, Zerzan cites Robert Temple's The Sirius Mystery as evidence that North American Dogon people knew of the existence of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye. Temple himself used this to defend the ancient astronaut hypothesis, which, as far as I know, Zerzan does not take seriously. Zerzan simply thinks that powers of perception and connection to the universe were much greater for hunter-gatherers, but, either way, he's drawing on some shoddy research there. Elsewhere, Zerzan has even spoken positively of the idea that before civilization, humans were capable of communicating telepathically. So apparently the wholeness of sensory experience prior to symbolic thought included telepathy. I mean, the point is a lot of primitivists seem to be, frankly, a little bit gullible. So this is one objection, but obviously this this is something that's specific only to some in the primitivist literature. Putting all this aside, though, there is another problem with the evidence that is used by primitivists, or at least by some of them. So, primitivists like Zerzan will point to anthropological evidence concerning societies such as the Kung Bushmen. But then Zerzan argues that, well, by his standards at least, these are not really primitive societies, because as we've seen, for Zerzan, even language and symbolic thought are out, right? So, I mean, obviously there are no human societies without language, so even if the empirical evidence used by Zerzan was watertight, right, it's unclear what role that evidence would be playing. It's like if I were to claim that modern civilization is environmentally sustainable, but then in order to defend that, I cited the environmental impact of the Roman Empire. Well, we can debate the Roman Empire's record on the environment, but it's beside the point. The Roman Empire isn't anything like modern civilization. So, in the same way, if the claim is that the problems started with symbolic thought, then it's just not clear what the point is of appealing to evidence concerning the San Bushmen. Now, of course, not all primitivists are as extreme as Zerzan, and I suppose even Zerzan would say, I guess even Zerzan would say, I can make a more sort of radical case, and I can make a less radical case, and at the very least, we have a case against civilization. Maybe we also have a case against language, but that's a separate point. But it is worth bearing in mind that the societies that we are drawing on as examples of how good primitive life was. We want to make sure that they do actually exemplify whatever we define primitive life to be. Okay, so that's one standard objection. Another standard objection to primitivism is the impracticality objection. The claim is that regardless of how good or bad civilization is, we're stuck with it. There's just no reasonable way of going back at this point. What would happen if we actually tried to dismantle civilization? Well, all the people dependent on modern medical care and drug treatments and so on would die. Many millions more would be impaired. More significantly, a hunter-gatherer lifestyle simply doesn't generate enough food to sustain anything even close to our current population. There are nearly 8 billion people on this planet. Without agriculture, we could barely feed 100 million. That's without even thinking of problems like nuclear waste and industrial toxins. Because as civilization collapses, those things are going to poison the environment and we're going to lose our knowledge of how to deal with them. So, think of maintaining the sarcophagus over Chernobyl. That requires technology. So the concern is that any serious attempt to realise primitivism would just lead to mass death. Now, there are a couple of responses to this kind of argument. First of all, the idea for many primitivists at least is that civilization will be dismantled over time. So we're not going to just abandon civilization overnight. That's not at all realistic. Rather, there will be a gradual process of reducing the dependence on technology, of rewilding, restoring wilderness areas, and so on. And as people come to see the problems of civilization, as the environment becomes increasingly unable to sustain modern civilization, and as increasing numbers of people shift to simpler ways of living, the population will naturally fall anyway. There's no need to worry about like mass killing of billions of people or mass deaths of billions of people, right? Those people are going to die, right, eventually, anyway. I think the point is, well, as we start to transition, right, there will just be a kind of gradual decline in the population. While primitivism may be one of the more extreme ideologies here, it's certainly not the only political view that would encourage population constraints. Right? Many people hold that the world is overpopulated and that we should try to bring the population down. We don't usually accuse them of advocating mass death. The transition would be gradual. Primitivists favour a much lower number of people than is normal, but I suppose that in principle they can make the same argument. And I mean, really, the key point is that the population will follow the technology, right? So once we shift away from a dependence on technology, or once we shift to different kinds of technology, the population is just going to naturally fall anyway. A second point that can be made by primitivists is, well, civilization is going to collapse no matter what we do about it. And this is the point of the second plank in the argument for primitivism. Right? The severe environmental costs make civilization unsustainable. There are so many problems, all converging around the same time, that it will just be beyond our power to solve them. So we don't really have a choice between abandoning civilization and continuing civilization. The question is just whether we want to be in control of the transition, or whether we want to just ignore it until there's nothing we can do. There are also objections to the anarchist credentials of primitivism. Anarcho-primitivism claims to be a kind of anarchism. Third objection is that primitivists will be forced to use authoritarian means. Primitivists will have no option but to use the power of the state to coerce people out of technological society. After all, hardly anybody actually wants to give up the luxuries of modern technology, and let's be honest, there's not much of a prospect of convincing enough people to make an impact. So you're just going to have to use the state to force people, and that's not anarchist. Well, obviously the primitivist response to this is to question whether this kind of authoritarianism will in fact be required. Indeed, notice that this is quite similar to a standard objection that is raised against other forms of anarchism. So the standard objection to other forms of anarchism will be like, look, people don't want to give up capitalism. People don't want to end the hierarchical structure of workplaces. I mean, okay, we might be able to convince some people of the benefits of anarchist society, but you'll never convince them all. So what happens to those people who voluntarily choose to engage in wage labour and who choose to, recognise assertions of ownership of land and who choose to set up hierarchical workplaces and so on? The anarchist is going to be forced to coercively interfere with them, and that's going to require a de facto state. Now, what anarchists tend to say about this is, look, we can demonstrate in practice that anarchist organisation is preferable. And just as under capitalism, there's no serious movement to, go back to feudalism, even though I suppose people could choose to put themselves in that kind of situation if they wanted to. Well, so it is with anarchism. Under anarchism, there just won't be the motivation to restart capitalism. It may be difficult now to conceive of an anarchist society, but once those changes have been made, once people actually live and work in non-hierarchical institutions, it will seem totally natural. Once people become accustomed to actually having autonomy and directing their own lives, they're not going to want to give that up. The primitivist may make the same kind of point, right? Once people are living autonomously outside of these kind of technological structures that impose hierarchy and authority. Once that kind of life becomes a live option, it's going to seem natural to many people. And after all, there are plenty of cases of primitive societies that refuse to adopt agriculture and technology. And additionally, the primitivist will point out that the luxuries of modern technology are kind of illusory, right? I mean, at the moment, the costs are kind of outsourced in a way that is actually unsustainable. And as those costs are increasingly being imposed upon people, even in the affluent societies, primitive living is going to seem increasingly attractive and indeed increasingly inevitable. Okay, a fourth objection, again concerning primitivism's status as an anarchist position, is that primitivism doesn't really offer a coherent political theory. There is an incoherence in particular in the application of the prefigurative principle. Again, this is the idea central to anarchism that the means of a political movement must prefigure its ends. Now, the trouble is that primitivists are forced to use modern technology. They are forced to use the tools of civilization in order to promote their ideas and, more generally, to go on living. So there's a dilemma for the primitivist here. If you take the prefigurative principle seriously, then, okay, you can find a way to put primitivism into action, perhaps. You might be able to find a way to live outside of civilization. Maybe you can get together with a few more primitivists and with a few other primitivists and, leave civilization, go and live in the wilderness. But then you're going to make yourself irrelevant. You're going to have hardly any influence. Nobody's going to know about your ideas. Alternatively, you can attempt to engage people, but by doing that, that's going to require modern technology. So you're going to be using a means that is incompatible with your end. Now, I think this criticism is somewhat unfair, but there is perhaps a grain of truth to it. So why is it unfair? Well, all anarchists will be forced to some extent to participate in systems that they regard as oppressive. An anarchist might publish a book within the capitalist publishing industry. They might use transportation services provided by either private companies or by the state in order to travel to protests and conferences and so on. So the prefigurative principle isn't the claim that you must never, under any circumstances, use tools that have been created by oppressive systems. That would be absurd. But the grain of truth to this criticism, I guess, is that other anarchists will be able to point to particular forms of social organisation, and they'll be able to show how to enact particular forms of social organisation in practice right now, such as to achieve an anarchist society, or they'll be able to enact forms of organisation that get everybody involved in such a way as to prefigure the anarchist society. They can point to things like strikes, mutual aid schemes, industrial unionism, and so on. And by engaging in these activities, we are actively creating anarchism. The concern is that for primitivists, there's less of a clear roadmap to the dismantling of civilization. Indeed, note that even though primitivists reject reformism, they don't want to reform civilization for much the same reasons as other anarchists reject reformism, we've also seen that any plausible form of primitivism has to be kind of reformist to a significant extent. We have to use the tools of civilization to gradually dismantle civilization in a carefully controlled way. Other anarchists do not need to use the tools of the state to dismantle the state, or the tools of capitalism to dismantle capitalism. Well, that will be the argument, at any rate, right? Like, certainly anarchists are going to object very strongly to socialists who form socialist parties and acquire state power and try to bring about the liberated egalitarian society in that kind of way. For primitivists, it's not so obvious how they can actually put their ideas into practice, because, again, if they put their ideas into practice, then they're just out of civilization and they have no way of influencing people. So there may be perhaps an incoherence here in a way that there isn't in other forms of anarchism. Right, well, those were just some basic criticisms of primitivism. I mean, this is already a fairly long video, so I didn't go into a lot of, I guess, deep detail there with those objections. But that's anarcho-primitivism. That's the introduction to that particular view. I hope you found that interesting. Goodbye.